Hello, in this lecture we're going to talk about behavioral economics and modern economic policy, chapter 22. We're going to start off with our quote from H.L. Mencken, who is a writer, and his quote's one of the more pessimistic quotes that we will see, but it is applicable in some ways, or it gives us some things to think about in the context of this chapter. So his quote is that, "Nobody's ever gone broke underestimating the intelligence of the general public. Nobody's ever gone broke underestimating the intelligence of the general public." Again, a bit pessimistic. It's taken a bit out of context here as well. It's actually a longer quote, and obviously it's in context to a specific area when that quote is taken, and you can look that up on your own. But I do think it's applicable in some ways here, because what we're going to talk about now is taking the behavioral economic models, meaning behavioralism, a psychology type of idea that means that people respond to incentives, that we can actually change people's behavior by changing the stimuli and applying that towards the economics, gives us then the idea, of course, that, well, we can change the way people make decisions, make in a way they will behave, and we can change the way they behave, if this is true, in ways that we want them to behave. Now, the reason this gets sticky is because it depends on where we're going to apply this. And now, clearly, if we talk about businesses, they're going to try to apply behavioralism, or try to put in systems and policies so that the outcome that they are looking for is achieved. And we know that that is going to happen both in terms of marketing, and also happen within the company. How should the company set up systems and whatnot so that they'll achieve what they're going to achieve? When we think about government policies and stuff like that, it can also get a little bit more sticky as well. And part of it is due to the fact that when we think about our traditional economic models, we think about this idea of the invisible hand, and we think about the idea of the huge advances of the invisible hand concept, and that concept basically being that the market actually does a better job than any small elite group of people coming up with decisions as to what we should produce and how much we should produce. So we know that markets themselves are actually a lot more efficient in a lot of ways than a group of people making those decisions. So it's somewhat reluctant to then think that an elite group of people should be basically, manipulating the market using behavioralism to come up with outcomes that are desired. Now, obviously, there are times when that's necessary, and we'll talk about the times when that should be applied and maybe when it should not be applied. And obviously, there's a difference between companies, and there's a difference between government policy, and there's times when the market doesn't quite work. And when we think about behavioral economics in these terms, we're usually trying to think about problems where the market doesn't really work, and we're trying to apply market mechanisms into a place that doesn't really work. We're trying to take into account market mechanisms because they work best, and take into account the problems with them, and use both of those tools. So this is a tool. Tools can be useful. Tools can be harmful. If they are applied correctly, they can be useful. So chapter goals: explain the relationship between behavioral economic policy and mechanism design. Define nudge and choice architecture and explain how they are related to behavioral economic policy. Discuss the problems of implementing nudges and how the behavioral economic frame changes how policy is viewed. Discuss concerns many traditional economists have about nudge and push policies. All right, so behavioral economic policy is in perspective. Behavioral economics broadens the assumptions about behavior to purposeful behavior and enlightened self-interest, basically saying that we're going to take our traditional models and we need to expand them for certain things. We need to expand them for things like people's desires outside of just monetary desires, people's desires to do good for others, people's desires to be part of society, and these types of things. These things are incentives that need to be included, and we need to find some way to measure them, and we like to do it quantitatively. And we've done this before, and when we think about the idea of utility and whatnot being this term, we try to calculate what people are getting from things, and we need to now take into account, or look more closely at the things that are non-monetary and put those into the model. Behavioral economic policy is economic policy based upon models using behavioral economic building blocks that take into account people's predictable, rational, irrational behavior. So if we observe people within the market, we notice that some things that we would think would happen in traditional economics aren't happening. And the reason for that is we can then use behavioralism and say, well, what are the circumstances here? Are there social pressures? Are there other things going on? And we can then predict based on a scientific method, based on observing and seeing how people react to different things, different stimuli, and we can predict irrational behavior. Again, I think that term is a little misleading because we know that based on the fact that the majority of people do it, it is basically rational. It's just that we need to figure out how people are making those decisions, how the mind works in different ways, in different social contexts, and take that into account in our model. So economic engineering is economics devoted not only to studying markets, but also to designing markets and other coordinating mechanisms. So whenever we think about this word engineering, you can think of that as the difference between just studying something for the love of studying and learning knowledge against, compared to, I should say, applying that information. So in something like physics is learning about the natural world for the sake of learning about the natural world. Engineering kind of takes those physics terms, puts them into application, and builds things like engines and whatnot. Same idea here. We're going to take the ideas of economics and behavioralism, behavioral economics, try to put that into a context in terms of engineering things that we want to accomplish. So behavioral economics and economic engineering. Coordination mechanisms are methods of coordinating people's wants with other people's desires. So we know that we have a lot of obviously wants and desires, and the choices, there's so many choices out there that part of what we need to do is basically be able to align the choices together. We want to coordinate wants and desires. So shadow pricing are prices that aren't paid directly, but instead are paid in terms of opportunity costs borne by the demander and thus determine his or her choice indirectly. So when we looked at these models, like the classical model doesn't generally take into what we're going to call these shadow prices. Shadow prices being things that are not basically in the price. They're going to be things that are influencing people's decisions, not based on price. Once we determine what those are, we can say, oh, we see what is happening here. We see that, you know, these people are reacting in different ways to things other than price. Well, then we can look at those other factors, those shadow prices, and then we can kind of measure them and then come up with models that we think are going to be more predictable. Shadow price analysis allows you to take morals and social pressures into account in your models. So when we build the models, we're going to take into morals and social pressures. So, you know, for things, even things like when we think about criminal policy and stuff like that, think about stealing or things in this nature, we have to think, well, it's not just the economics of it. If someone could steal something without being caught, they're also measuring that against their moral principles, and that needs to be somehow in the equation, because people generally have that in there. So how that's somehow given them somehow worked out into the equation, into the utilities calculation. So modern economics mechanism design involves identifying a goal and then designing a mechanism such as a market social system or contract to achieve that end. So economists who use mechanism design engineering to develop policy take an existing mechanism apart with the intention of improving it. So if we're going to design the mechanism, what we're going to do is we're going to say, okay, we can see the market. Usually we look at the classical model. We're going to say, okay, here's what we have. Here's what's kind of not working. Let's try to take this apart. Let's re-engineer it. Let's put it back together and try to improve on it by basically changing the incentives a bit. So mechanism design, economic engineering, use laboratory experiments, field experiments. So when we look at this, we go out and we see the practical applications of things. We see how people actually react. Then we can kind of see that in terms of a field experiment. We can see, okay, what's going on? We can set up laboratory experiments. Again, they're usually behavioral laboratory experiments. We're going to bring people in, put them in different settings, and have a control group, and the group we're testing on, and try to see how their behavior differs, and then try to see what the things are that are measuring that difference. Other than just money, we're gonna assume that there's things outside of that in the model. We can use game theory, the classical game theory being the prisoner's dilemma. There's a whole field on itself in terms of game theory to try to think out how rational game theory would work. Computer simulations is another area where we can do immense calculations and look at outcomes based on different like game theory models. Think about the outcome of whether the game was played over a long period of time in ways that we have really not been able to do in the past. And a variety of other tools come up with mechanisms that achieve the desired ends. So of course our goal at the end of the day is to achieve an end goal. That's the idea of an engineering versus just learning for learning's sake. We're putting the model together not for knowledge itself, but for an end goal, which sometimes can actually drive us to learn a lot more than we maybe otherwise would have, because it can motivate us. So behavioral economic policies develop as a way of tweaking existing coordinating mechanisms to make them work better, taking shadow prices into account. So what we're going to do is we're going to take the existing mechanism, which is basically going to probably be built on just normal free markets or on a classical model, and then try to take into account the shadow prices and see if we can better align the incentives to better achieve the outcomes we're looking for. Behavioral economists argue that because people are social creatures, the coordinating mechanism that economists design must take into account much more than simple price incentives. So the classical model just has price, meaning all else is equal. I mean, there's only two things on the axis. There's quantity and price. And obviously that could be effective in certain, that is, the majority effective thing in many, many areas. However, when we put things into different contexts, we have to say, okay, there are a lot of contexts where other things are impending on the decisions that are being made. We need to measure those. For example, when a daycare center imposed a fine for lack of pickup, the fine commoditized the choice and late pickups rose. So you can picture a daycare service saying, hey, we've got our staff staying here late because they're sitting here with kids that are supposed to be picked up early. Well, maybe we should impose a penalty. And if we impose a penalty, we charge people, $20 for the late pickup, then that will get people there early. And we can see the logic of that. But we can also see the logic of the people that are now picking the children up late. They're now saying, they might be thinking, well, so you're basically charging a daycare service of $20 for a little bit late pickup. I'll indulge in that service. I will be happy to provide the $20 for you to run your daycare business, right? A little bit longer. And so you can see how the mix-up happened. They've now commoditized what people figured to be the price of picking up something late, which some people are more than willing to pay, rather than before people picking up basically saying this is when you have to be there because people have to leave, so therefore they're actually would try to show up on time in that case.